Okay, so this is our video lecture for Chapter 4, The Wise Man Socrates. Um, because I'm using a program called Screencast-O-Matic, the video has a limit in the amount of time I can record. It's one of the disadvantages to an online lecture. There'll be at least one full 15-minute lecture, and at the end of this lecture, when I finish, I'll let you know if we're going to continue into another video. These learning objectives you should be able to answer, and some of these will show up in a quiz that will be attached to this video once you're finished watching it. And not all of them will be covered in the video. Some of them you'll have to find on your own in the book or read through on the slides. You should answer what is the Socratic problem and what is a paradigmatic individual. What is the Socratic dialectic? What role did Socrates' ugliness play in his philosophy? What role did Socrates' poverty play in his philosophy? What role does Socrates' claim of ignorance play in the philosophy? What is Socratic irony? Why did some Athenians think that Socrates was a sophist? Remember, we talked about a sophist, these sophists, last week. And what is Socratic intellectualism? The Socratic problem is sort of the definitive account of what we know of Socrates. Socrates wrote no philosophy, at least nothing we have written access to. Everything we know about him comes from his student Plato and from Xenophon. So we do know the way that Socrates lived his life. And his philosophy is inseparable from the way he lived his life. Guthrie, who wrote that we must have no, first-hand accounts. We must all have us, to some extent, our own Socrates, meaning that each of us has to decide for ourselves just what Socrates actually thought, because his own work wasn't written down. So that is a Socratic problem, is that Socrates didn't leave his actual work for us. It comes to us through second-hand accounts. So what is the general character of Socrates? Plato presents Socrates as an integrated individual who stood clearly for some values such as goodness and beauty, and clearly against others such as money and prestige. He thought that beauty and goodness should be determined by usefulness and fitness of function rather than mere appearance or personal feelings of delight. Socrates was reputed to be less than attractive, so perhaps for this reason Socrates taught that the true self is not the body but the psyche, a combination of what we think of or as the mind and the soul. So, to the learning objective, Socrates' ugliness or lack of attractiveness played a role in his philosophy, being that looks don't matter. It's the usefulness and fitness of function of an individual that counts. Socrates was apparently poor, or at least presented himself as poor. He was usually barefoot, and he had one tattered coat, about which his friends joked. Some enemies accused him of being unwashed, which in Greek society would have been quite an insult. His poverty led to one of his most noted characteristics, which was his hardiness, reflected in remarkable self-control or temperance. Temperance is indifferent to the presence or absence of material pleasures. It's different than abstinence. It's not going without, but it's being indifferent to the presence of pleasure. So you don't seek pleasure, but you accept pleasure if pleasure's there, and the absence of pleasure doesn't bother you. This is in some ways similar to a couple weeks ago when we talked about Buddhism as detachment. And detachment doesn't mean you don't care. It doesn't mean that you don't seek pleasure. It doesn't mean that you don't seek the good things in life. It means that you sort of accept their absence or their presence, and you adapt to it. So continuing, Socrates' self-control. Socrates indeed claimed that to have no wants is divine. So Xenophon's account of Socrates used the term incontinence to talk about the lack of self-control and self-discipline, which Socrates did not have. So paradoxically, a life of self-control rather than the self-indulgence of satisfying all desire leads to more pleasure. That's because someone with self-control can manage his own life and be useful to friends and society, where someone with incontinence lacks self-control and self-discipline and will often get themselves into trouble. I'm sure you all have, a dramatic friend, and this sort of drama seems to follow them wherever they go, and this drama leaks into the life of others. So Socrates would call this dramatic person incontinent, whereas the absence of incontinence would be self-control. Socrates is an archetypical individual, or paradigmatic. The philosopher and psychologist Karl Jaspers coined the term paradigmatic individual to refer to a special class of teachers, philosophers, and religious figures whose nature becomes a standard by which culture judges the ideal human being. Socrates is one of those rare human beings whose very nature represents something elemental about the human condition. In other words, these paradigmatic individuals are sort of the ideal person in a society. So, think of the idea of a philosopher. You think of Socrates, even though he didn't leave written philosophy behind. That's why he's paradigmatic. Think about in your world, remember we all create our own reality. In your world, who would be a paradigmatic individual? Who would be a paradigmatic example of, say, a teacher or a leader, a political leader or a community leader, something like that? When you think of leader, who do you think of? Who comes to mind? That's what it means to be paradigmatic. Different cultures in different eras produce different archetypes. Remember, we talked about different archetypes and how they're represented at the beginning of class. So Jaspers uses his examples of Socrates, Confucius, Buddha, and Jesus as archetypical individuals or paradigmatic individuals. Individuals of very nature demands a response. What is it to be a human being? What is most important? What is good? How should I lead? How should I live? Because their very natures demand response, paradigmatic individuals shock and provoke extreme community reactions. Everybody has a reaction to figures like Socrates, Confucius, Buddha, and Jesus. That's why they're paradigmatic. And when you think of Christianity, you automatically think of Jesus. So Socrates had an electric shock effect on Athens, and it's resulted in indictment or arrest, conviction, and execution as a traitorous blasphemer. Speaking for the last time as a public figure on trial for his life, the 70-year-old philosopher repeated what he always insisted: I neither know nor think that I know. In Plato's dialogues, we often find Socrates engaged in conversations with others. One outstanding feature of such conversations is Socratic irony, another Socratic method, also known as Socratic dialectic. Socratic irony, Socrates often makes use of irony. An ironic utterance communicates on two levels the meaning, a literal or obvious level and a hidden or real level. In his conversations with others, Socrates used irony to suggest there was something they could teach him, when he was actually showing them that they did not clearly understand themselves the things they claimed to have knowledge about. One example is in the Apology, where Socrates uses irony to refer to the pervasive abilities of his accusers, when really they had not persuaded him of anything. The Socratic method begins with the assumption that the function of education is to draw the truth out of the student. So rather than filling the empty vessel of the student's mind, Socrates sought instead to draw wisdom and clarity out of a disordered and confused soul. Socrates functions as a kind of midwife, aiding others in giving birth to their own insights by drawing out what they already have there. The midwife example is a good one, because you don't want to think of Socrates as actually creating anything. Rather, he drew out from your mind what the knowledge or the ability to create order that you already possessed. Socrates' midwifery accounts to a questioning process known as the dialectical method of inquiry. In the early Platonic dialogues, dialectic inquiry usually begins with Socrates' interlocutors defending a muddled definition. Socrates then uses skillful questions to guide his opponent closer to the truth by allowing the opponent to experience the logical inconsistencies in his own stated position. So in other words, when someone says something that Socrates would disagree with or would think was wrong, he wouldn't be like, "You're wrong and you're stupid and here's why." He'd ask them questions about their experience or their opinion and bring out the inconsistencies. So, oh, the sky is blue. Well, how do you know it's blue? Can you see blue right now? Look up at the sky. Is it blue? That's a very simplified example, but it's that sort of question. Even if Socrates and his interlocutor did not succeed in arriving at a single answer to questions like what is justice, they were at least a bit clearer than before. Again, Socrates always maintained he didn't have answers. This was Socrates' experience, but others often seemed to be angered and frustrated, if not humiliated, as their confusion and ignorance were exposed. In a passage from the Republic, Plato provides a good example of Socratic dialectic when Socrates enters into a dialogue with the sophist Thyras Macus, or whatever. The exchange begins when Thyras bursts into a discussion Socrates is having about the nature of justice. Thyras defends the sophist's contention that might makes right, and that justice was determined by the interest of the strong. He claims that the unjust man always profits more than a just man. Socrates replies by exposing a contradiction in Thymas position when he agrees that rulers can mistakenly give orders that will harm them, and yet, so you say, it is right for their subjects to obey. In those circumstances it follows that it is right to do the opposite of what you say is right, and that the weaker are ordered to do what is against the interest of the stronger. In other words, if a king gives an order that will cause him harm, he's not doing right, even though he has the might. From the perspective of Socrates, Thymas real mistake arises from his lack of philosophical self-reflection. In the Apology, a Platonic dialogue about his trial, Socrates makes the famous claim, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Socrates believed that the human psyche, or soul, or mind, and capacity for reflective thinking is what is most definitive about human nature. In other words, the ability to think, to process. If I do this, it will lead to this. It's what makes a human a human. An unexamined life takes the psyche for granted, and is objectively incomplete and deficient in value. The story of the oracle. Socrates obliviously tried himself to live an examined life. But how did he come to his vocation? Why did he embark upon his mission to help others examine their lives? It all begins when Socrates' friend Chaerephon went to the oracle of Delphi and asked, "Is anyone wiser than Socrates?" The oracle's answer was no. That is, no man is wiser than Socrates. To find out what the oracle meant, and if it had said what was true, Socrates spent his life talking to others, hoping to find someone wiser. He engaged in conversation with politicians, poets, and artisans. When Socrates learned that nobody he questioned was wise, although they believed that they were wise, many had special skills in the field of expertise, professed to know things beyond that field. In the light of this, Socrates interpreted the oracle's pronouncement as meaning not that Socrates is the wisest man in Athens, as in having a more than human wisdom, but rather that anyone is wise who, like Socrates, knows he is not wise, thus demonstrating human wisdom. Thus, the wisest person is the person who thinks they know nothing, according to Socrates. I'm going to pause here and upload this video, and later tonight, I'll upload the second video, which will bring us to the end of this lecture.